In 2021, the Apple App Store brought in a total of $85 billion worth of revenue. Out of this, $20 to $25 billion went straight to Apple. This itself is insane, but if we look at it in terms of profit, things become even crazier. Historically, the App Store has boasted an operating margin of 78%, meaning that $17.5 billion of this is pure profit. For perspective, Apple as a whole nets $114 billion per year, meaning that the App Store alone accounts for over 15% of Apple's entire bottom line. Apple currently boasts a valuation of just under $3 trillion with $114 billion worth of profit. So, with $17.5 billion worth of profit, you could argue that the App Store itself is worth roughly $460 billion. That would make the iOS App Store the 15th largest company in the world. Even if you want to be super conservative and cut that valuation in half, we're still talking about a market cap of $230 billion, which would still make the App Store roughly the same size as Coca-Cola or Toyota. And when you zoom out, this is really not all that surprising given that the App Store was responsible for $1.1 trillion worth of transactions in 2022. For perspective, even Amazon only boasts half that revenue. But forget companies. With $1.1 trillion worth of essentially GDP value, the App Store would rank as the 17th largest country by GDP. But it was by no means an easy journey getting here. In fact, Apple initially didn't even have plans of launching such an app store. And Steve Jobs' insistence of doing everything the Apple way has caused quite a bit of trouble for Apple in regards to the App Store. So here's the full story of the Apple App Store and how powerful the App Store really is. With how successful the App Store has become, it's natural to think that this was always part of Apple, or more specifically Steve Jobs' grand vision for the iPhone, but that's not actually the case. In fact, the original iPhone didn't even have an App Store, and while Apple was working on an App Store in the background, it wasn't meant to be something big. It was just supposed to be a place where users could download auxiliary apps from Apple themselves. In fact, Apple had no intention of letting third-party developers onto the App Store at all. Steve Jobs figured that developers could just create web apps that could be run on Safari. This would be easier for developers to adapt their existing platforms and easier for Apple as they wouldn't have to police the App Store. But developers weren't exactly a massive fan of this idea. They would protest on forums and purposefully avoid creating mobile versions of their web apps. But what really pushed things over the edge was the jailbreaking community. Just a few days after the iPhone launched, developers would put together a jailbreak for it. And just a few weeks after this, the jailbreaking community would come out with the world's first iPhone game called Lights Off. Lights Off was a very simple, straightforward game that never really caught on, but it's what it represented that really mattered. This game was an assertion from the developer community that if Apple wasn't going to directly allow for native development, they were just gonna do it on their own. And that's exactly what happened. In October of 2007, the community would release an easily accessible jailbreak called AppSnap, which came with its own app store called installer.app. This would quickly evolve into Cydia, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, and it's what finally got Steve Jobs off his high horse. The same month that installer.app was released, Jobs would release an open letter to the developer community. He didn't quite apologize for his previous stance, but he did announce that a native app store was coming very soon. Imagine if Jobs hadn't relented. Cydia would have become magnitudes larger than it did, as a lot more developers would have jumped on board. Apple may have even been forced to support Cydia at one point if it became widespread enough. But fortunately for Apple, Jobs made the right choice and launched their own app store on July 10, 2008 with just over 500 apps. On paper, the launch was a massive success. Within just the first weekend, the App Store would reach 10 million downloads. Just 2 months later, they would reach 100 million downloads, and within just 9 months, they would reach 1 billion downloads. But putting these insane numbers aside, Apple was actually having quite a tough time internally, because Steve had insisted on doing everything the Apple way. Despite technically giving developers what they wanted with the App Store, Apple was still receiving a bunch of backlash from developers. Likely the biggest reason for this was that Apple was forcing developers to use Apple tools to make apps, Xcode and UIKit. Since then, we have seen alternatives and more neutral languages pop up like Flutter, but the bread and butter of iOS development is still Xcode, which a lot of developers are still quite salty about. In fact, that's why Xcode has a relatively low rating of 3.1 stars. It's not that Xcode is bad per se, but simply that a lot of developers are still pissed off that they're forced to use it. But this issue with the developers was the least of Apple's concerns when it came to the App Store. Likely their biggest issue was actually supporting the insane scale of iOS development. With something like Windows, this was never a problem because Microsoft doesn't really control what can be installed on Windows machines. So all they had to do was create an open platform and support a broad range of implementations. Everything else was up to developers, whether it be testing or distribution or scale. The same, however, could not be said about the App Store. You see, while Apple does allow developers to make apps for their various devices, iOS is still not an open platform. It's more of a quasi-open platform, as every single line of code that makes its way onto the App Store has to be manually reviewed by Apple. On one side, this largely limits what developers can and cannot do, and that's why jailbreaking and Cydia were so big despite the App Store. On the other side, this ensures that everything on the App Store is of a certain level of quality and doesn't contain malware or viruses or anything harmful. This is why all iOS apps have a certain aura about them when it comes to UI and completeness. But this also means that Apple has to manually review every single version of every single app. Yeah, I think you can see why that would be rather hard to manage, and Apple doesn't take these reviews lightly either. Of course, you'll hear about something that slipped through the cracks here and there. For example, they once accidentally approved an app that would straight up let users jailbreak their iPhone. But for the most part, Apple's review system is very robust. In fact, 40% of App Store submissions are rejected, largely due to nitpicky things. For example, a keyboard might have been partially covering up a text field, which made the UI not as pristine. Sometimes Apple will even reject an app on the basis that they don't think it's valuable for users. But not only does Apple pride themselves in picking out the smallest of mistakes, but they aim to do it within 24 to 48 hours. Again, I don't think you'd be surprised to hear that Apple has 500 people working full-time to review iOS apps. But not only is the App Store labor-intensive, it's also capital-intensive. Going back to Windows, for example, if you want to download Photoshop, you would head to Adobe's website. And it would be up to Adobe to ensure that their website and servers can scale to demand. With the App Store, however, it's all up to Apple, aka they currently have to support 142 billion downloads every single year. With the average iOS app being 34 megabytes, we're talking about 4.8 exabytes or 4.8 million terabytes worth of downloads every single year. Clearly, following the Apple way with the App Store has cost Apple quite a bit. But fortunately, there was gold at the end of the rainbow, which brings us into the economics of the App Store. Apple has a few ways of monetizing the App Store, starting with directly charging developers. Every year, each developer has to pay Apple $100. Technically, there is a free tier that you could use to mess around with coding iOS apps, but if you actually want your apps to end up on the App Store, you gotta get the paid tier. As of 2022, Apple had a total of 34 million registered developers. How many of these developers are on the paid tier is unclear, but it's very possible that this fee alone generates over $1 billion in annual revenue for Apple. Given how much Apple makes off the App Store though, this pales in comparison, which brings us into Apple's main mode of monetization, the Apple tax. For apps that generate less than $1 million per year, developers have to pay 15% to Apple. And for apps that generate more than $1 million per year, developers have to pay 30%. Recently, these fees have gotten a lot of criticism as being the 30% Apple tax that's applied to all revenue that goes through the App Store. But that's not quite how it works. I mean, think about it. $1.1 trillion worth of revenue goes through the App Store. If Apple charged 30% on all of that, that itself would be $330 billion worth of revenue, or a whole nother $3 trillion company. While the App Store is extremely lucrative, it's nowhere near that lucrative. In reality, Apple actually only makes $20 to $25 billion per year from the App Store. So in terms of percentages, they're only earning 2 to 2.5% of the revenue that passes through the App Store. And this is how Apple largely defends their 30% fee. But that's not to say that the fee is small like Apple claims either. The reality is that Apple's fee is quite large, but not to the people that you might think. Take Amazon for example. They don't release official revenue stats for their desktop versus their mobile app. But according to sellers, it's usually about a 60-40 split with the majority of revenue coming from mobile. AKA, Amazon pulls in nearly $300 billion every year thanks to their iOS and Android apps. But it's not like they're paying $100 billion to Apple and Google, who by the way has nearly an identical pricing model with the Play Store. How do they avoid this massive fee, you ask? Well, it's not due to some sort of secret background deal, though they do have that as well. The real secret is simply that Amazon has the authority to directly charge customers. Almost everyone has their credit cards directly linked with Amazon, so Amazon has virtually no need for Apple's payment infrastructure, which is where the Apple tax actually applies. It's basically the same case with every other big company or financial platform. These guys can charge you directly, so they don't have to deal with the Apple tax. The only notable exception to this rule is streaming services. People often subscribe to streaming services out of impulse and forget about it. And these streaming giants don't want to lose out on customers by slowing down the process and asking for credit card details. So they'll often just use Apple's double-click to pay stuff. With that being said though, you should be careful when subscribing to these services through Apple because it's often more expensive. YouTube Premium, for example, normally costs $14 per month. But if you buy it through the app using Apple's payment infrastructure, it's $19 per app to account for the 30% tax. So all of the big companies that account for the vast majority of the $1 trillion going through the App Store don't even have to pay Apple a dime if they don't want to. The people who actually end up paying Apple a boatload is smaller developers who are solely dependent on Apple's payment infrastructure, which is usually game developers. People like RobTop from Geometry Dash, Supercell from Clash of Clans and Clash Royale, or Nintendo. These guys have been trying to fight the Apple tax for years, and it seems that Microsoft has also joined this fight, which is not surprising given their recent gaming acquisitions, but the Apple tax still stands. Hopefully with time, these guys can bring down the Apple tax, which would be huge for smaller developers. But honestly, it doesn't really matter for Apple because in the end, it doesn't really change how powerful the Apple App Store really is. With historically high interest rates, the appeal of bills and bonds is higher than ever, yet traditional brokerages haven't really adapted with the times. They still expect people to use clunky bond tables, scroll through long overwhelming lists, and even use virtual keyboards till recently. And that's why we created our own modern bond platform, Silo. At Silo, we prioritize the user experience and the ease of finding and investing in the issuers you know and trust, so that you too can easily lock in high yields. Also, choosing a strong user experience does not mean sacrificing on safety. Every Silo account is insured by $500,000 in SIPC insurance and $2.5 million in FDIC insurance. Also, all funds deposited on the platform will be maintained by our trusted custodian, Interactive Brokers, who has experience managing $373 billion worth of assets over the past 45 years. So, if you're looking for a modern way to invest in bonds, please consider checking out Silo in the description below. If you think the Apple App Store is too powerful, you should check out Android because they're on a whole nother level. Check out this video to learn more, but until then, I'm Hari, and I'll see you guys on the next one.